I'm Nina Gopal. This is Global Express, where we examine issues that have an impact on India, on the neighborhood, and beyond. Welcome, viewers. Has US President Donald Trump's hectoring and bullying of Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy in the White House 2 weeks ago paid off? Or has Trump's pressure tactics of cutting off military aid and intelligence until Zelenskyy agreed to a deal to share his country's $500 million mineral wealth, and a 30-day ceasefire after the US-led March 11 Jeddah peace talks between the two sides concluded, has it seen Ukraine capitulating? I mean, giving Russian President Vladimir Putin a window to move in on Kursk and play for time. Why did Zelenskyy agree? Did he get the security guarantees he had demanded at the White House? There's no pause in the fighting. Ukraine has unleashed over 300 drone attacks on the Russian capital, Moscow, as talks began. It struck the Moscow oil refinery, a key oil pipeline, and oil depots, and a Russian airbase. Russian forces have been steadily advancing in Kursk, Sumy, and in Zutsa, which they declared was their capital and have done so for the last so many days. They've seized territory, they've forced Ukrainian troops to retreat, which brings us to this big question. Why would Putin even agree to a ceasefire? He doesn't seem to have done so. He's said he's agreed to a ceasefire with nuances. I don't know what that means. He's already snubbed President Trump's special envoy, Steve Witkoff, saying that they do not consider him a mediator for the war in Ukraine. And Putin's aide, Yuri Yushakov, has been equally dismissive of the US envoy to Moscow, Keith Kellogg, as has Trump, actually. So the US proposal, Trump has dramatically signaled his support for Putin when the US voted alongside Russia, the North Korea, and Iran and 14 other countries against any condemnation of Russia. He's spoken to Putin, whom he describes as his friend. He's now warned, however, the Russian leader that he must agree to the truce without any preconditions or face sanctions. And Poland has added to this little game by asking the US to position nuclear missiles on its territory. NATO chief Mark Rutte is in Washington, I'm supposed to warn Trump on the perils of withdrawing from NATO. But Putin, it seems, clearly has no intention of walking back from the battlefield victories that has brought back its sphere of influence. And Trump, who's projecting himself as a peacemaker, does he not see the pitfalls ahead? Why is he staking everything on Putin, especially when Putin already sees the resumption of intelligence sharing with Ukraine as a betrayal? Where does it leave India? I mean, we're a long-time Russia ally. The Modi government is carefully navigating the Trump administration, mollifying Trump's shadow president Elon Musk, Vice President J.D. Vance, US intelligence chief Tulsi Gabbard. But in recent years, India has also built very strong links with the European Union, with French President Emmanuel Macron. Where does this all lead? Talking to us today are a duo who are experts on this geopolitical push and shove that, until Putin's stalling for time, raised the prospect of the United States withdrawing from Europe, from NATO, from the UN. Major General Jagatbir Singh, Distinguished Fellow, United Services Institute, is a Russia specialist. He's closely tracked the Russia-Ukraine war. He was involved even in back-channel talks with Pakistan. He's commanded the prestigious 1st Armored Division. He's had 2 tenures at Defense Services Staff College. He's a prolific writer and commentator. Welcome, General.
Thank you very much.
Also, wish you a warm welcome to Dr. Oleksandr Svitych, an associate professor at the OP Jindal Global University School of International Affairs. He's an author, he's an expert on both international affairs and political economy, and he's a native Ukrainian who's written and spoken extensively on what has happened in his homeland. Welcome, Dr. Svitych.
Thank you very much.
I'd like to start with you, Dr. Svitych. I hope your family in the Ukraine is safe. I hope that the other members of your wider circle are in good shape. What is the reaction of the ordinary Ukrainian to the Jeddah peace proposals? And is there any truth to reports that the first thing that Vladimir Putin wants is a change of government in Kyiv, that he wants Vladimir Zelenskyy replaced with one of his puppets. So does Zelenskyy have the popular support to keep him in office? Has he lived up to people's expectations? Do the people of Ukraine trust that this proposed cessation of hostilities will be reciprocated by Russia? Because Russia clearly wants the front lines to be frozen for the de facto border between Ukraine and Russia to become a de jure. He wants the territory that he's taken. So what are the options before Ukraine, dependent as it is on the US for both intelligence and arms?
All right. Well, thank you so much for this insightful introduction to the war. And thank you for having us during this especially festive day. I really appreciate this. Let me start by saying that the war has gone for more than 3 years now.
That's right.
And obviously, many people are tired in Ukraine, both the soldiers and civilians and political and military leadership. And to answer the question, what do people expect? There are several ways how to go about it. But there are indications both from public surveys and from anecdotal evidence. You know, when you talk to people in shops, you talk to taxi drivers and so on, that for the last few months, the idea of ceasefire has been the major discourse among the Ukrainians. Oh, by the way, I would like to make a side note here, just to make sure we're clear on terms. Ceasefire or armistice and truce and peace are different ideas, right? Ceasefire refers
That's very
to
interesting.
yeah,
I'm sure the general will agree with you.
Yeah, I would like to hear the general's comments on that as well, of course. Ceasefire implies a short-term cessation of hostilities, whereas truce already is a move towards a more durable peace. And peace, and of course, we've heard many forms: sustainable peace, enduring peace, just peace, is already the outcome, the goal. So, as for the ceasefire, there is evidence that a lot of Ukrainian people, especially civilians, are in support of this idea. Of course, the real question is, what do we give up in return? At the same time, when you ask the military are very skeptical. According to the military, any ceasefire will only give a pause to the Russian troops. It will allow them to rearm. It will allow them, again, to accumulate their weapons, their personnel, and so on and so forth. And furthermore, among both the civilian population and the military personnel, there is a shared sentiment that Putin cannot be trusted. And I think this was also made explicit by President Zelenskyy in the Oval Office when he raised an important issue of some kind of security guarantees, noting that previous ceasefires, such as Minsk 1 and 2, were broken. Now, there's a lot to unpack here, of course, and maybe we can discuss later what they mean by peace, because both Putin and Zelenskyy and Western partners and all other nations use this term. But coming back to your second question, whether Putin really wants regime change, I believe he does. In fact, that was one of his ambitions from the very beginning of the invasion. And here I also would like to make even a step further back to 2014, where actually the larger war started, right? Normally we associate, when we say Russia-Ukraine war, we go back to the February of 2022. Now already in the literature, in the historiography, the idea of the Russo-Ukrainian war goes back to 2014, when Russia annexed Crimea. Right.
I was going to say, so you were talking about Crimea.
Yes, and incited the war in the eastern Ukraine, where I come from, by the way, the war in the Donbas region. But basically, already back then, when the so-called revolution of dignity happened, or as we call it in Ukraine, Maidan, the popular uprising, when our president Yanukovych had to flee, a president who was very pro-Russian, who made a treaty in Kharkiv where he exchanged, cheap discounts for Russian gas for essentially leasing out the fleet in Sebastopol in Crimea. And he did many pro-Russian policies, adopted pro-Russian policies. Essentially, he had to flee. And that is when Putin raised the stakes. That is when he interpreted the popular uprising as a Western plot, considering his background from KGB, considering the legacy of the Cold War. So this is when already he had in mind the change of the government back in 2014, and nothing has changed ever since.
Maybe the general can come in at this point. So if you could just tell us what is the actual situation on the ground, because I mean, militarily, how is Russia placed in the war? Because there is a lot of talk about how they have, they've retaken Kursk. That it's a huge, and his appearance in Kursk, was like a signal to the world that he was not going to accept the ceasefire proposal, and that this was an unspoken no. We don't know what all that, whether that's true or not. And he's actually asked, he was dressed in that military uniform for the very first time, which of course has had a lot of reaction across the world. And the battle continues. So does Russia have the resources to continue this, the war, General? Does it have its foreign currencies depleted? Its gold reserves are depleted, I believe. Its manpower has been depleted too, I believe. And it's now hiring North Korean mercenaries to do the job. What is the ground situation?
See, it's a ground situation varies from what paper you read and what you listen to. So the couple of things I want to just talk about. Firstly, I thank you for calling me on this panel, and I'm very glad of the issue raised, by my fellow panelists. So there is a difference between truce, ceasefire, armistice, and a final negotiated peace agreement. So where we are now is truce and ceasefire, basically stopping or ceasing hostilities. But the issue that has come up is little more than that. So I'll just get back to that. So two issues stand out that we've seen a change in presidency in the US, and that is the change of President Trump coming in, which you just completed about just little over
50 days.
Yeah. And normally people, talk about the first 100 days, but because of the amount of things he's done in the first 50 days, people are talking of the effect of the first 50 days. And one of the things is rapidly, dismantling crucial elements of post-war international order. Their territorial claims, their economic threats, and there are various things going around. And one of the issues, apart from, claiming various Canada to be 51st state, one of the issues is that he said, I'll bring peace to Israel, Gaza, and I'll bring peace in Ukraine. Now, to bring peace in Ukraine, this is my thing. My panelist has his own opinion, actually. What does he do? He's got two players, and I've always said there are multiple tables talking peace. Now, one table is you have Russia talking to US, you have Russia talking to Ukraine, you have the EU talking to Ukraine, and you have the UN talking about peace. Ultimately, the table that has to negotiate has to have Russia and Ukraine present on the same table. This is the first point. Now, when President Trump has taken on this role to, enforce peace or get about peace, he he's like a deal maker. He talks of deals because that's his background.
True. He is the ultimate deal maker.
Yeah, gives an ultimatum. So he threatens the weaker partner, like you saw what he did with Zelenskyy, that basically he called him a dictator. And then he said that you're not interested in peace, you must have peace. And finally, President Zelenskyy has agreed to the terms of America to negotiate for peace. And one of the terms when they went to Jeddah, which my panelists have not spoken about, was what they said was that the Ukrainian position at that time was we will have peace in the skies and we will have peace in the seas.
That's
meaning
right.
carry on with the ground offensive. Now, with this as the background, they went to Jeddah. But finally, what has come out of the meeting there, which was spoken by Rubio also, was the proposal of a 30-day ceasefire. Now, the Russian position, what I've read, is they said, yes, we are agreeable to a 30-day ceasefire. But
Are
like
they? Are they really? It
no,
doesn't look like as if it
I'll
is.
just come to that, man. They're agreeable
Yeah.
to a ceasefire, but does the ceasefire follow at the end of a negotiation, or does the ceasefire take place and then negotiations start? So the two sides are looking at something totally different. So the Russians are saying that first you negotiate, what are we having this ceasefire? What are the terms of the ceasefire? And then we'll come to the end of it. So what do the Russians visualize from this? That's as per my reading. And the first thing they say is we need to discuss the territorial issues. Donetsk and Luhansk, do they form part of, do you recognize them as part of Russia? That's the first thing. The second thing they're asking for are what are the security guarantees which are being given to Russia? Now, are you going to start rearming Ukraine to a degree? Is Ukraine going to form part of NATO? So the next thing is, what are the limits of the NATO expansion? That will be the third issue. Fourth thing is, naturally, what is going to happen about the sanctions against Russia? Are they going to be lifted? To what degree they are going to be lifted? What about the frozen assets? Now, France the other
That's
day said
right.
that I've got 200
They,
million, 211 million I'm going to
they're
give
going
to
to seize
Ukraine.
those assets, is what
That is
they've
not
said.
the
Yeah.
so what you're seeing now is while this thing is going on, there are heightened escalations taking place. Now, as I spoke to you earlier in your channel some months ago, I said one of the critical areas where Ukraine made an error was they pumped in troops into coast region with if they had the ability to push that forward to strengthen it, prevent it from falling, it's an advantage. If they're not, they're going to get trapped over there. And as a result, they were weakened elsewhere. So elsewhere, you saw their defenses weren't broken, but they were being bent to the degree. So the defenses were bending. And today, what has happened? This heightened tension. You've very rightly covered attacks on, you know, Moscow by drones, large attacks on Moscow by drone firing, and Russia is when the talks are going on, is pressing the accelerator duly westward. So today, Suji is taken. They've got troops in Sumy trying to prevent anything else taking place, and they're pushing westward elsewhere. So they're taking advantage of this window so that when the ceasefire and when the talks do take place, they will be in a better position to negotiate what they feel is required for them. So unfortunately, this is the game that is being played now, and it's and NATO has taken a backseat, though there are reports and very credible reports that an envoy of advisor of the British Prime Minister Starmer, Jonathan Powell, was in Kiev, and he was part of the group that hammered out this ceasefire
I
agreement
see.
and willingness of Ukraine to enter the ceasefire. But what has happened is, after this has gone, today the Americans and the West are saying the ball is now in Putin's court. So now they're saying it's up.
Is that really true, Dr. Stivich? I mean, are you really seeing Putin going to run with that? Because he doesn't look as if he wants to make any concessions, and he's got all these red lines. I mean, the red lines are very clear. He wants to keep Kursk, he wants to keep Crimea, he wants to keep those three other provinces. He doesn't want these security guarantees that Ukraine is asking for, which is basically a European Union defense force, and he will not stand for Ukraine joining NATO. So, how is it possible? I mean, Trump's dressing down of Zelensky said that he had no cards to play. What cards does Washington have to play? What do they have to pressure Putin into accepting anything?
That's a wonderful question. And I think we need to go back before the negotiations in Saudi Arabia. Apparently, what Trump has tried to do, by the way, as quite succinctly summarized by Major General Singh, Trump is someone who is, this disruptor in the international arena and also domestically, of course. And also, me and my students, we call him a populist, which means he wants to, use all the resources to pitch this conflict between himself and the elites. But what has come out is that Trump, in my opinion, has failed to find anything on Putin. and instead he chose to exert pressure on Ukraine as the weaker side. And that also came out quite starkly during the debate in the Oval Office. And by the way, I don't think that the freeze on the military aid and intelligence, which has now been restored, happened because of that scene. That could have been a trigger, but even before that, again, as Major General Singh pointed out, Trump expressed a lot of hostility both towards Zelenskyy and Ukraine, with both his rhetoric and action. So, to go to the response of Putin, again, this was quite predictable in my opinion, because when you roll out the 30-day proposal of ceasefire, then essentially Putin was faced, I believe, with three options. First is accept as it is, which is of course a no-go, as you correctly pointed out. And as Major General pointed out, he's bent to fight till the end. So accepting the ceasefire without any compromises was not an option. The first option was, the other option was to reject it completely. And by the way, also, as some of you pointed out, that this was done by his advisor, Ushakov, before the official announcement by Putin. I think Putin has tried to play it in a more smart way, looking for a chance to restore relationship with the United States, which Trump himself initiated. So Putin is in a way trying to hold on this chance and see where it can go. So essentially trying to prolong possible negotiations. But there are a few important aspects here. Again, I would like to agree on the one hand with Major General. This is a very important distinction because both Ukraine and the West, the US, emphasize now that there must be a ceasefire first, which can be an opportunity to negotiate peace and negotiate the conditions for further peace. For Putin, this is the opposite. And again, he explicitly announced it. He himself, then Foreign Minister Lavrov and other members of his administration, that were not interested in a quick ceasefire. Indeed, they are doing quite well on the battleground. Just one small remark. There are no troops in Sumy. Sumy is the capital of the Sumy province. There have been troops reported crossing the Sumy province, the border with the Sumy province, but they're not in the capital of the province. And
no, I agree with you. They're not in Sumy proper, but they're exerting pressure towards Sumy to prevent people from there being diverted to the other front.
Correct. Yes, yes. Totally. And just, to conclude maybe and to pass over to Major General, what Putin announced in his yes, but reply, that yes, we are okay with the ceasefire, but we have these so-called nuances. He pointed to the, again, idea demilitarization, but there is nothing new about that. This was one of his goals from the very beginning of the invasion, to demilitarize Ukraine. So again, this looks like, again, a vicious cycle. And at that end, Putin talks about enduring peace. He says that we need this ceasefire to ensure enduring peace and to remove the roots or the root causes of the, as he puts it, crisis. Of course, he does not use the word war. But the root causes are Russia's imperialist and chauvinist attitude, Russia's inability to get off Ukraine out of its sphere of influence, which of course also includes Ukraine's Euro-Atlantic aspirations, either joining the EU or NATO or any other alliances. So, in fact, from the Ukraine side and from the, I would argue, the Western perspective, a precondition for endurable peace would be, among other things, to demilitarize Russia, not Ukraine. But again, we can talk about it.
Well, General, if I could come back to you, under the Biden administration, which Trump has trashed over and over again, saying that if he had been there, he would have prevented the Russian invasion of Ukraine. But do you think that at that point in time, when Russia did invade Ukraine, before that there were talks? I mean, there was apparently the two sides were talking. The US and Russia were talking about this, and they did. Do you feel that Biden blundered in not arriving at a kind of a deal with Russia at that point, or maybe it's wrong on all our parts to say that, because maybe Russia was definitely had no intention of backing out uh, whatever Biden would have said, but it's come at
Well,
such a high cost.
yeah, actually, you can say that the West has made critical errors right from the beginning, and the error
Hmm.
starts when they started moving NATO eastwards. So there's no doubt about that. And Russia has always seen that as a red line. Russia and Ukraine were, multiple times what has happened. I mean, I wouldn't like to go into the history of Ukraine and Russia, the closeness, the language, the people, the problems that they faced. But Ukraine was the number two Soviet republic after Russia, part of the Soviet Union. So there's no denying that. So naturally, uh, Russia under Putin felt they had been humiliated and they wanted what they see as where the imperialist Russia was. Now, your other question is what I said somewhere. It's surprising that when in World War One and World War Two, Russia was the country that came to the savior of the West as far
That's
as
right.
victory in these two countries goes. There were Russian troops who sacrificed the largest amount in World War Two. So this region, as far as your somebody said that they'll run out of time, they're tired. I feel that they have a fiercely nationalistic spirit, and that has been evident right from the time of the Napoleon Wars. And so they weren't given that easily. He has always stuck to this line of his red lines of NATO. So, yes, to a degree, and there were ample warnings over there. But today, where we are, is that war did take place. 3 years of war has taken place. The war has affected the world. Where are we moving from here? The whole world wants peace. Our prime minister said we're not neutral, we're on the side of peace. So everybody is looking for peace. But now, when you come to the peace talks, is the issue which I raised is what are the guarantees of peace? How do we enforce the peace? How will it be done? President Trump
So
himself has
the
ruled
big
out.
question then is, General, is that is Vladimir Putin laying a trap, so to speak, for Trump? Because I mean, by pretending that he is going along, when in actual fact, what he will do is, what a lot of people are saying is that he will just drag it along so that he will not be forced into giving up the land that he has the territory that they've acquired, that Russia has acquired, and no way that he will allow any presence of NATO in or troops in Ukraine. So we know what the red lines are. We know Russia's superiority on the ground. Where is it going to go then?
Okay, now about this. The first thing is that today, when President Putin spoke, one of the first things he did was he thanked President Trump for the efforts he's taken towards peace. And amongst the other world leaders he thanked were Prime Minister Modi and President Xi of China. Now,
Yes.
the other question of yours is regarding the territorial issue. And I think that was made very clear in the remarks of the Defense Secretary, Peter Hesketh, when he spoke just before the Munich Dialogue Security Conference when he ruled out three things. He said that Ukraine will not get its territory back. Two words to that effect. The
My
next thing he said,
gosh.
yeah, he said that the issue of territory is difficult or it's impossible. They've said it very categorically. The other issue he said is whichever troops are stationed, they will not be part of Article 5. So these two things have been stated very categorically and very clearly by the Americans before even President Zelensky's visit to Washington. So I mean that was something earlier. So the takeoff point for the talks was that where Russia, the present, like I wrote about it. I said that the current line of contact where the two troops are should be taken. Like in India, you have a line of control. But of course, nobody would like a line of control in Europe because a line of control implies that there are physical troops occupying it and there's fighting taking place across it. but it doesn't get
that
beyond
is
that.
quite intriguing. That is quite.
Yeah.
Dr. Svitych, if I can come back to you, I mean, this European Union's meeting in Brussels recently. I mean, it has alarmed. It's brought Europe together, even though Trump has repeatedly said that he doesn't want NATO presence. But can France, Germany, and the United Kingdom, I mean, among 32 NATO countries, actually ring fence Ukraine? At least as the general says, maybe create some kind of barrier, or so that the Russia will not attempt another, I suppose, attack on Ukraine. Because Putin, he'd like to go back to Yalta when half of Europe was under the USSR, and including the Baltics and Georgia.
I'm going to answer this question, but first let me go back and, if I may, to disagree with Major General on the so-called NATO red line. And the reason I would like to disagree a bit, because in my opinion, and again, there has been substantial research also on this, both among academics and policymakers, the NATO expansion was not the major cause for Putin's aggression. By the way, let me just remind you that, and this is exactly literal what I wrote my master's dissertation back in 2008 about, that the Eastern expansion, which included the Baltic states, the Central European states, like Poland, Slovakia, and Czechia, NATO was reluctant to accept these members. These countries pushed themselves. They negotiated fiercely to get accepted into NATO. It was not NATO which expanded.
This was Poland and the Baltics.
Yes, because they felt insecure, they felt threatened in view of the Soviet legacy and in view of Russians' ambitions in Europe. And again, Russia's invasion of Georgia, for instance, in 2008 was a testament to that. Furthermore, if we consider seriously that it's all about NATO, the fact that during this war, Finland and Sweden have been accepted, and as a result, Putin literally did nothing, also falsifies this theory. Now, of course, there are prominent scholars who insist that NATO must not have expanded. One of them is John Mearsheimer. But even on the surface, these two examples, which I just mentioned, they undermine this argument. It's not about NATO. And to understand what it is about, in fact, Putin himself at times is very eloquent. On the eve of the invasion, he published his so-called pseudo-historical essay, where he argues on the historical unity of the three peoples, Russians, Ukrainians, and Belarusians. In this long essay for several thousand words, he barely mentions NATO. The thrust of this argument.
So you're basically saying it's not the NATO expansion that had, that brought about the invasion of Ukraine. What did?
It's Russia's self-understanding of which role it should play in the world. It's all about Russia's identity, which I think Major General also touched upon that, saying that Russia felt humiliated. And because Russia perceives itself in the world as a great power, these alliances like NATO, or Ukraine trying to get independent and get out of the orbit of Russia, is perceived as something unthinkable. The root cause of the conflict, of the war between Russia and Ukraine, which goes back to 2014, is the inability of Russia to accept independent, sovereign, and politically, Western-oriented Ukraine. NATO is only one part of the equation. Security concerns cannot be isolated from these deeper identity issues, right? Now, I come from Eastern Ukraine, as I mentioned. I have spoken Russian for most of my life. And this is, people speak Russian a lot in Ukraine up until recently. I have been fully immersed in Russian culture. So I also understand a lot about Russia and what kind of country it is. Even at the mass level, Ukraine has been always treated as the so-called junior brother, Russia could not conceive that the 2014 uprising was a genuine popular uprising for democratic European country, not a Western plot. Now, going back to your question, Nina, about the meeting in the Brussels and also the summits in Paris and London, I think, well, on the positive side, as Major General pointed out, Trump trying to disrupt the rules-based international order. On the positive side, what this may lead to is essentially Europe gaining more agency again in the international arena. And I think we're seeing signs of that, especially with Ursula von der Leyen announcing a multi-billion, 800 billion defense package, where Europe essentially will be rearmed. There'll be lots of investments in its own industry, defense.
So you're saying your European defense force is very, very likely.
In my opinion, it's going to pick up. The real question is how much time it will take. And, as history shows, Europe is usually quite slow to consolidate itself. And again, the history of this war has shown itself that Europe has come to aid Ukraine, but usually with delays and a lot of bureaucratic hurdles and so on and so forth. But nonetheless, it seems that this is a chance for European countries and the EU to become more consolidated, become more united. And obviously, also luckily, right now we have Kaja Kallas, who is the head of European diplomacy, who comes from Estonia, who also understands the wider risks of Putin's aggression against Ukraine. And again, if we're talking about sustainable peace, for Putin, sustainable peace would be to swallow Ukraine. Because if there is no Ukraine, then there is peace. Nobody fights against you. If there is no state and nation like Ukraine, that is sustainable peace for Putin. And that is
a very good point.
To be prevented.
Very good. General, if I can come back to you, do you expect, if this European Defense Force actually comes into being whenever it does, until then, what will Trump do vis-a-vis NATO? Because, will he do an Afghanistan in Europe? Will he keep his, go to his threats and his bluster and actually withdraw US troops? Because, it is, quite, it'll be, if it's the end of NATO, it's what everyone's talking about, or will this just be a NATO name only?
Okay, so my first point is what my panelists brought out regarding the NATO issue. That's a debatable thing we can carry on. But you cannot compare Ukraine with Sweden and Finland for the simple reason that Ukraine was part of the USSR and part of the Warsaw Pact, whereas these two countries had nothing to do with the Warsaw Pact. So there's a difference between these two, but I will just leave it at that.
There was a Finnish-Soviet war as well in 1939.
Yeah, so
yes, that's true.
Of post-World War II security architecture of Europe.
Yeah.
Okay, and the next issue is back to this thing of European expansion. Now, NATO has been told very clearly, Europe was shown the mirror by Vice President Vance when he spoke at the Munich Security Conference. Basically, that they felt that bulk of the, bills, so-called, were being underwritten by the United States. The United States security budget is far greater than all the NATO countries put together. The United States defense industry is far greater than anything. The US has been the most dominant player in this team, if I can tell you. So if your most dominant player is now hesitant to play in your team, what he tried to say, that was what worried the Europeans. And then they got about what they said, the coalition of the willing with France, with Germany, and with UK.
Britain.
Yeah. So, this is one issue that is there. The second issue is what you said. They've said $900 million, but how long will this pipeline take to get these weapons in place? People are estimating, even with all the sanctions in place, even with all the industry in place, and Germany has certain internal strictures on spending on defense without borrowing money. They're trying to move a law now that they can go into deficit financing.
That's right.
So they're saying it will take 10 to 15 years. So my question:
But are you seeing I mean, the European Defense Force will take 10 to 15 years to come into
No,
fruition, that's for sure.
fully arm themselves. That's what is being written about.
Correct.
It takes this much time. By the time now, even your UK, which has given tanks to them, had to pull out tanks from a museum to give challengers. Yeah,
That's
so I mean,
right.
so you have to realize that the biggest player in the game today, as far as defense goes, is US. But US did it actually cut down or stop its intelligence sharing? If it had, how was I mean there are people who say that the Ukrainian strike that took place on Moscow had certain inputs from would have had certain inputs from US. The problem with Ukraine may face is that if Starlink turns off its communication channels, then what?
That's
These
right.
are other issues. So yes, they are going to be. President Trump is pushing Europe towards standing on its own feet as far as defense goes. But like you rightly brought out, there are 37 odd countries part of NATO. So some of them have very small armies, some have larger armies, some have, other strictures. So by the time they all get together and the threat each one feels from Russia is different. Poland feels one threat, the East European countries feel one threat, whereas a country like Portugal or Ireland feel a different threat. Norway, when told that, will you provide peacemakers over there, said, what do I have to guarantee? Spell that out. So
Yeah.
some people
No,
are saying that
it's very clear that NATO
some people are saying
but
there are going to be no troops over there. It's only going to be monitored by satellites. And if there are violations, now the best way answer is that if there's a violation, if there's something, then NATO does Ukraine get membership of NATO if it's violated?
no, but are you saying that NATO will be sort of the presence of American troops will be will be lighter on the continent and that's what Trump is threatening? I
Well,
mean,
that's
will he
what he
go
wants.
ahead with it?
That's what he wants to do because he feels that the greater threat to US, he needs to focus on the Indo-Pacific and on China. That's
I
what they're
see.
perceiving as their greatest worry. And one of the reasons why they are moving towards this peace deal is because they felt Russia was getting closer to China. So you have a
That's
block
right.
of Russia and China. So in the 70s, you had Kissinger make overtures towards China to break the partnership between Russia and China. And now
And
you have
make overtures to Leonid
taking place.
Brezhnev.
Yeah, now you have the opposite taking place, whereas they're making overtures towards Russia to break the glowing, cooperation which has taken place between Russia and China. So this is the, I mean, it's where you put your focus. Their focus is in China. Next focus is in the Middle East, in West Asia, Israel. And they feel that Europe now needs to shoulder its own responsibility. Now, to what extent he'll pull out troops, you can never tell because his there's he stopped the sanctions. I won't give intelligence. I won't give arms. Next day he's restarted that. So I mean,
Yeah.
same way with troops will take place.
That's right. So, Dr. Svitych, I just want to come back to you. So, you're basically saying that, Putin has got his own game plan, that, now we're talking about Trump's game plan. Do you see America making common cause with Russia? I mean, making common cause with Ukraine's enemies so that, I mean, you lessen the presence, the footprint of NATO, and then, you have Putin's negotiating tactics dragging out for such a long time. And Putin is pushing, for a Trump Putin summit, where he's acknowledged as an equal almost. Or, what do you see happening? Or are these attempts to derail the whole peace track? Or, what is going to happen? Are Trump and Putin going to make peace and leave Ukraine, you know, cut off?
Well, as it seems at the moment, at least up until recently, Trump has chosen to put pressure again on the weaker side, which is Ukraine. Now, why is he doing that? Well, I mentioned in the beginning that I don't think that he had anything to pressure Putin and there are other important factors. So one is Trump is obviously trying to cut a deal, as he puts it, right? I hate this phrase, but again, as was mentioned, he is so-called an expert in deal making, as a businessman. So he adopts this transactional approach. And of course, he wants this quick victory for his domestic audience as well. What is more disturbing, in my opinion, is apart from this transactional kind of quick fix mindset, is the ideological affinity between Trump and Putin. Both of them aspire to go up and fight against liberal values. Both of them declare that liberalism is dead. Both of them see NATO and other military alliances as unnecessary, whereas Putin considers them as a threat. Trump views NATO as essentially free riding on the United States. So it's very dangerous. Now, I don't think that, there are some conspiracy theories that Trump is a Russian agent. I think what he does is inadvertently helping Putin and essentially pushing Ukraine towards, again, up until recently, towards the course of surrendering. Even before negotiations, Trump announced that NATO membership of Ukraine and territorial getting back land is out of the question. Now, these are important things to negotiate about. And even before any negotiations, he completely dismissed those, which is, of course, playing in the hands of Russian president. So I think what is we're going to see soon, whether Trump is going to continue this logic. Now, he threatened that he will impose tariffs on Putin if he does not cooperate.
Yes, that I thought was very interesting, actually. That was the first time that he threatened Putin.
Right. Well, actions speak louder than words. So what is going to be very interesting, what is going to happen next, because Putin neither rejected the proposal nor he accepted it, without any counter proposals. So my expectation is that Trump will continue to put pressure on Ukraine and President Zelenskyy. And then Ukraine will have to navigate these dynamics with the help of hopefully Western partners. And maybe I will conclude, just pass the word to the Major General, is that when we talk about peace as the final settlement, again, I said earlier that NATO is not the cause for the war. It's about Russia's imperialist aggression and its identity politics. So to achieve peace, several things will need to be done. First of all, Russia will need to demilitarize. And in the long run, obviously, after Putin, Russia will need to surrender its nuclear weapons. Now, of course, Major General will disagree, I suppose, but that is a true precondition for long-lasting peace. Another important condition which needs to be done immediately is, after cessation of hostilities and reclamation of all territories, Russia must apologize publicly for all the atrocities it has done to civilians, to soldiers, for all the war crimes it has committed, both towards Ukraine and other nations, like Georgia, like the Afghan people, and so on and so forth. There are other preconditions. Russia, of course, will need to pay for all the damage. Whether the frozen assets can be confiscated or used, that's another question. But obviously, repatriation is critical for any long-lasting peace, and just for Ukrainians to have any opportunity, a chance to reconcile with Russians. Otherwise, this war will continue for years, and Ukraine will perceive Russia as an enemy, existential enemy for generations.
Dr. General, if you can also sum up, do you see this way forward? And if you could just bring in India as well for a minute, because India's relationship with Russia is a very old and a long-standing one. So where do we stand on all of this is also interesting.
Okay, I have 2-3 quick points.
Yeah.
So the first issue is, he raised some very pertinent points, some points which I don't want to comment upon, like demilitarization, removal of nuclear weapons. That charter is huge. I don't think we can get into that. But my last thing is, the two issues is that, today what we're seeing is what he pointed out, that liberal values. Today, the individuals seem to be greater than the institutions. And we've seen it all around. He talked of President Trump. People have talked of President Zelenskyy being like that, President Putin, President Xi of China. So they're all in that game. Lasting peace is only possible if neither side tries to undermine it with acts of any proactive acts or any action. So trust these steps are going to take place. As far as India is concerned, we've had deep ties with Russia. We also have excellent ties with Ukraine. Our Prime Minister visited both countries. We said
But
we
that
are
was
not.
not a very, it didn't go very smoothly.
Yeah,
It
but
did,
we said we are not on the side. We are on the side of peace, and
yes, that's true.
we got
It's
huge
not a
military,
time for war.
and the Russians have stood by us over the years. So I mean, there's no denying that. 71 war is a case in point when the Soviet Union stood by India against
It was the
that.
Soviet Union, not Russia. Sorry, just to comment. Yeah.
So that's what I'm saying. So these are all the issues. There we have seen a spike in violence, but ultimately you need peace in this area, and that's the side that India wants, is to have peace, but it has to be durable, and there have to be some sort of security guarantees, as the way I see as a military person.
So basically, to sum up, we don't see Putin actually moving forcefully on bringing peace. He would like this. He wouldn't like a cessation of hostilities. He would like the war to continue, or he would like a situation where Ukraine is, ringed off and fenced off, and he doesn't get to give up the territories that he has actually taken over, especially Kursk. So we don't know where it's going to go. We can't. We in India, of course, can't afford to alienate either Russia or Washington. It's a huge challenge for India. And in conclusion, I think India's biggest challenge will also stem from whether this Atlantic alliance is going to crumble. We need an honorable peace, a peace which is not a capitulation, a peace which is not defeat, peace of defeat. So it's still early days yet, and we'll have to see how it all plays out. Thank you very much, Major General Jagatbir Singh, for joining the show, and thank you very much, Dr. Oleksandr Svitych, for coming on the show as well. Thank you, viewers, for watching Global Express. Please click on the new Indian Express website and share.